without it having an impact. And then the Saudi-Pakistani strategic alliance, in fact, brings that South Asia rivalry directly into the Middle East, as we're seeing that now UAE is also reaching out to India and Israel to essentially create a counter balance to that. So India and Pakistan are becoming part of this game to create a new regional order. And then on the other side of the Middle East, which we don't pay much attention to, we're having basically a collapse, if you would. And that is in Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. And that fracturing is not around necessarily Iran anymore, but it's actually around UAE, Saudi, Egypt, Turkey, UAE rivalry, and Israel has also now entered into it, which means that, particularly the way Saudi Arabia, for instance, looks at what's happening in the Horn of Africa and Yemen, is about, again, what is the final shape of this regional balance of power. Now, I mean, the obvious question often is, what is the U.S.'s position on this? I don't think the United States has thought long term in terms of where does the dust settle, what kind of an order does it want. Unlike President Biden, who envisioned a Saudi-Israeli normalization combined with trade to be the anchor of regional security, I don't think President Trump sees it quite in those terms. I think they basically are following a strategy of seeing where the dust settles, and some of the conflicts that are coming forward is all new to Washington, like the Horn of Africa, Yemen, clash between UAE and Saudi Arabia, bringing India and Pakistan into the foray. These are all sort of issues that Washington is reacting to and sometimes just sort of digesting what it means. But I don't think there is a theory in Washington about what is the end, what is the shape of the end of the end. And in a way, it is the players on the ground, Israel on the one side, Arabs on the other side, and Turkey, that are actually trying to basically create a scenario in which the United States would ultimately be happy with and accept. And that also adds to the certain degree of uncertainty. China and Russia, and I know we're having a session on China afterwards, but in a way are not directly impacting this rivalry in a major way, either economically and definitely not in material terms. But the consequences will visit on them in a way. Because in large measure, at least one way the United States sees the Middle East relevant is where does it fit in terms of America's rivalry with China. Anyways, I'll stop here. I know it raises more questions than there is, but I hope we can, continue the conversation in question and answer. Thank you.
Yes? We don't have much time because we ran over our starting point. So I think I'm going to ask 3 or 4 questions from the professor. We won't have time for a Q&A from the audience, but I think he will be available. He'll be talking specifically on Iran in a subsequent session. So perhaps many of those questions can be addressed to him at that time. For the time being, I think I'm going to focus on the subject at hand. So obviously the first question is, which I'm sure is on everybody's minds, that Wali Nasser Saab said that there's been a collapse of the old order. If there's been a collapse of the old order, does that mean that we are in the midst of a transformation? Does that mean that there's going to be a complete break from the past? Or does that mean that there's just going to be more of the same sort of conflict, an unending conflict. And in corollary, in a sense, the other questions that obviously follow from this is, if this is a transformation, then what is the end game here? What is the end game for each of the main actors? You have Israel, you have the United States, you have Iran. Then, of course, you have the states on the periphery of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and of course Saudi Arabia. So what is the end game here for each of these actors if this is going to be a transformation?
Let's put it this way. I mean, there are some actors that have a much clearer view of what the end game is. I think in Israel's view, they've come to a conclusion that they could impose their will on the region militarily. That they could defeat and destroy enemies, and then other countries they basically can bring to heel by use of military capability. And they demonstrated that with Qatar. There might be an argument of imperial overreach, as historians say, but we're not at that point. But they have a very clear vision of where this stops. It stops basically where all of the enemies are gone, and the last major one is Iran. But then the Turks think that they might be also be pushed into adhering to Israel's will. But it is a very I would say militaristic and imperialistic view of what the final end of the game would be. And we also are in a period in the world where, if you take your cue from Washington, I mean, Washington's own view of world order is not a balance, is one of domination and dictation. Now, I think everybody in the region is uncomfortable with this, because that's not what their national interest all along has been. Yes, they've worked with the United States, but they benefited from the United States, but they also think they manipulated the United States to their own advantages. And so whether it's Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or Turkey, they are uncomfortable with what does the current trends mean for them. And even if you looked at the board of peace that President Trump has put together for Gaza, there's no Palestinians on it. It's very clearly, it's almost like a colonial, oversight of the Palestinians. And the one country that has been symbol of resistance, in an exaggerated way, maybe Iran, is now folded. And the rest of the region is not capable of doing anything about it in the end. So I think the region is very uncomfortable with where things are going, but they don't see where the end of the tunnel is. And they're trying to position themselves in a way to get the best possible outcome.
In specific terms, you say that Iran is a has-been. Its influence is almost evaporated now in the region. It's trying to survive. Then what happens to Hamas? What happens to Hezbollah? What happens to the PLA? What is the situation regarding these? Because obviously Israel and the United States want to disarm them and finish them off. So what do you see happening to them?
I mean, it's a very good question. There's a lot of these questions that are on the table. For instance, there are, if you talk to Shia Arabs, even middle-class Shia Arabs, they're extremely worried where the sudden disappearance of Iran might mean for them, not even at the regional level, but within their own societies. That are they back to a time when they were basically subservient in Sunni-dominated orders or not? And then Hamas, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shias, the Hashd al-Shabi, etc., are all imagining a very different existence. Some of them are basically thinking about the fact that the resistance is over, that they have to join the political process. That, for instance, is the case in Iraq. In places like Lebanon, for instance, or with the Palestinians, perhaps the resistance will go on. I mean, you cannot have occupation and imperialism, colonialism without resistance coming back. But it will be in a very different form. So what Hezbollah, I think, people in Lebanon worry about is no longer organizing around missiles that it was lobbing into, that it could lob into Israel. That period is gone. They're imagining going back to the period between 1982 and 2000 when they fought guerrilla war against an occupying army. So I don't think, this is almost like going back to the 19th century colonialism. Imperial powers can imagine absolute domination by military means and imposing their will, but ultimately that is not a satisfactory scenario. The locals will organize and will fight. So we may end up in a period of relative calm in the short run, but unless the United States, Europe, and Israel as well think of a political order that is not just imperial dictation, but actually creates conditions for stability, I think then this is going to come back in another way at another time. I mean, resistance will come back in another way another time, maybe without Iran, but it doesn't mean that the Lebanese are going to accept South Lebanon basically being eaten up or their villages be occupied just because Iran is no longer there.
From this it follows that we need to talk a little bit about this so-called peace committee or peace council that President Trump has set up, because apparently this is going to provide the solutions to the Middle East, and perhaps even more beyond the Middle East. So how do you see this working out? Because a lot of these countries, it began with 20 or 30 countries, and now we're talking about 70 countries, and then we're talking about invitations being given to some countries, and then those invitations being withdrawn, for example, Canada. So countries like Pakistan, etc., have had to willy-nilly be part of this because the consequences of not being part of this could not be countenanced. And I think that goes for a lot of these Muslim countries who decide to join. But the other countries are also joining in, who are not Muslim countries. So what is this? How do you see this panning out?
Well, we would love to be proven wrong. For the sake of Palestinians, in particular, I hope we could be proven wrong. But I'm dubious because usually the way things work is that you first negotiate what you want to do and all the terms. Then you decide on a board to oversee its implementation. The way this has been happening from the beginning is that you start from the end and then work backwards, which is you first have a board which is not clear what it's going to be doing and what is actually going to be overseen. And so there has to be intense negotiations about what is it that this board will be implementing. And then that raises the question about the composition of the board. So a board that is basically created in a haphazard manner without consideration of representation of people who actually you're going to be dealing with and the region you're going to be dealing with makes it highly suspect that it would be effective. I mean, there's not a single Palestinian voice, even a co-opted Palestinian voice on that board. There's not real Arab representation, Muslim representation on that board. And yes, countries may play this game of trying to manage President Trump or be in his good graces by being on this board. But that's the wrong reason to join the board, because it means that the effectiveness of the board or the work of the board is not actually the reason they're joining in. They even don't have a stake in it. Like, why is Palestine be important to Pakistan beyond the symbolic issue? Why would Pakistan put a skin in the game in an effective way for any details there? So the countries that really the future of the Palestinians matter to them are Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Palestinians themselves, maybe some European countries that have worked on this a long time. That it actually would both represent the views and also help it implement it. So, it's difficult not to be cynical about it. As I said, I hope I'm wrong, and that there's a whole new theory of doing things that would work out. But if history's guide, I don't think it's going to work out very smoothly.
How do you see the so-called normalization process between Israel and say countries like Saudi Arabia and the others. How do you see that working out now? Has that ended? And what's going to be the new normal?
Well, you have to see, first of all, what was the purpose of the normalization, and why would countries want it, right? Why is it that countries want normalization? What do they get out of it? The Arab countries that are up for normalizing with Israel have never gone to war with Israel. There's no land issue between them. There's no demarcation issue between them. So whether UAE recognizes Israel or not is symbolic for both of them, and there might be symbolic value for both of them. And similarly with Saudi Arabia and Israel. I mean, Saudi Arabia and Israel already have financial intelligence, other sorts of relations. It's just that they don't have an embassy. So now you have to see what's the value of a Saudi embassy to Israel. Yes, it's valuable, but it's not valuable enough to change Israel's position on the Palestinians. And then what's the value of an Israeli embassy to Saudi Arabia? That's also been diminishing because the domestic cost to that recognition, given the Gaza war, has actually been going up. And then there's a terms under which you actually recognize one another. Those terms, in my opinion, have significantly shifted in Israel's favor since October 6th, 2023. In other words, the terms at that point were perhaps more in favor of Israel in favor of Saudi Arabia to get certain concessions out of Israel. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think the Israelis are not willing to give an inch for that recognition, and pretty soon they may be in a position to demand it, regardless of whether the other side wants it or not. And that, to me, is exactly the point about how much the sort of balance of power in this region has shifted as a consequence of this war.
There's another dimension that very few people talk about, but I'd like you to enlighten us on that. What's the human impact of this conflict? The fact that public opinion, especially amongst the young people in America, is turning against Israel. And what is the impact on the Palestinian youth, and of course, indeed, on the Israeli youth inside Israel? What's happening there?
Well, I think for Israel, the loss of reputation in Europe and the United States is actually quite significant. But I think at some point it became the sunk cost of their campaign to eliminate their threats once and forever. And I think that's now sunk cost. I mean, even if they stop the war, did things differently, that's not going to come back. But I think the mindset of the Netanyahu government, the mindset that set in Israel a rage against what had happened on October 7th, created an environment that this became an accepted cost. That we need to do this once and forever and finish it off. But that's not to say that this has not been costly to them. There is a cost. There's always a cost to war. On the other side, I mean, the Middle East has been battered, is a region that has been traumatized and battered on and on and on. I mean, there have been wars, there have been devastations, there have been civil wars. Countries have been torn completely apart. They lack a state. Syria, Lebanon, Libya. And I think the Gaza war, in terms of everything that happened and everything that is still happening, is still a massive trauma that is being absorbed. We're not going to see the consequence of this right now. But it's very difficult for me to think that this does not come out somewhere. I mean, the rage, the anger in the Arab world has to go somewhere. It either has to go to a final acceptable settlement for the Palestinians, in which case you would say, okay, all of this was worth it, they ended up with something. That doesn't seem to be the case, and this board of peace, etc., is not in that right direction. Or it's going to come out in form of terrorism, another Arab Spring. It may take a few years before this happens. I mean, in the Middle East, we've seen this, that eruptions are sort of come after a fuse slowly burning over time. But, part of what I'm saying is that these 2 years really have been an earthquake in the Middle East. An earthquake which we have watched up close and sat in the middle, so we don't quite see the exact extent of devastations and how much things have changed. And we're still not at the end of it yet. But I don't think the aftershocks of it are going to be gone very quickly.
So you talk of an earthquake. So how has this earthquake impacted global imperatives, global policies, implications for global politics, alliances, enmities, polarization, all the rest of it?
Some of it is not palpable. I think during the past 2 years, and particularly during the Gaza war, I think the West, that's Europe and the United States, but in some ways Europe more because it was the upholder of the international liberal order, have been strategically diminished in the global South. I mean, when I was listening to Jim Carney at Davos, very eloquent, very correct, but this didn't start with Trump's land grab for Greenland. The lie that he all of a sudden was claiming that he's discovered and he's telling the world that we're living a lie, I think everybody in the global South saw how big a lie that was during the Gaza war. And so, in a way, the Gaza war is part of the larger, Gaza war and everything else that's happening in the Middle East is part of the larger, set of massive changes and collapse of the order that we're seeing. And in a microcosm, the Middle East came back in a big way for at least a year, 2-year period as a center stage of international affairs. And let's say, I mean, if the United States end up attacking Iran and it ends up being a very big war, then, the Middle East is going to be impacting United States, Europe, the global order, on an ongoing basis. So the idea that the Biden administration had, that there's a way in which to basically sufficiently reduce Middle East's, exposure in global order so nobody cares about it, we can focus on China, is no longer the case. I mean, the Middle East is now front and center, and that's not going to go away. And unless and until there is a stability is brought back to the Middle East in a way that is viable and resilient, it's going to impact the global order and the broader region around it as well.
You mentioned the changing dynamics of the middle powers, the regional powers, like Turkey and Qatar and Egypt and the UAE. How do you see these evolving now in terms of their regional compulsions?
I think all of these Arab countries have seen a diminishment of their stature and strategic importance. Egypt and Jordan's great value for a long period of time to the United States was the role that they played in Israel's security and managing the Palestinian issue. In the current dispensation, Israel really doesn't need them anymore. And it's not interested in resolving the Palestinian issue. So, the value of Egypt or Jordan to an American vision for regional security is much, much less. The Gulf countries have tremendous amount of influence in Washington, largely because of their wealth, both oil and sovereign wealth funds. But at critical junctures, their ability to sway Washington has not worked. I mean, when President Trump first went to the Gulf on his first state visit, they thought they convinced him on the importance of a Gaza deal and a nuclear deal with Iran as a basis for stability in the Gulf so everybody could make money. And President Trump instead gave a green light to Israel to attack Iran and then join the fight itself. And these countries have found that increasingly they're not able to dictate the shape of a final deal in Gaza. They're welcome to join it and support it just to remain relevant to the conversation. But what we're seeing, the board of peace, the shape of the Gaza plan, Sharm el-Sheikh, none of it is essentially their doing. Yes, they have some influence, but not tremendous amount of influence. And then within the region, the wealthy oil countries are too small and their militaries are too little to be able to have an impact on the conflicts themselves. Right? So they need to stand on the shoulders of Egypt or Turkey or try to hope that, to keep Iran alive, but they themselves are not big military players. So there is a discrepancy there where the Arabs have armies, they don't have money and they don't have influence, and where they have influence, they don't have armies and they don't have the population size. And in a way, there's a lot of Arab countries, but all of them put together, they're not they're not able to play that kind of a role.
So how do you see US policy evolving in this region? President Trump seems to have his fingers in a lot of pies. He's got a problem with Europe. He's got a problem with Greenland. He's got a problem with his Monroe Doctrine. He's got a problem with rising China, Russia, Ukraine. So how is he going to deal with the Middle East in all this?
I mean, that's itself is one way in which people in the region analyze the situation, that he may get overwhelmed with all the things that he's doing, and that might impact what he does in the Middle East, if he does it, to what extent does he do it. And Middle East could very quickly go to number 3, 4 in terms of priority. It's very clear that he doesn't see the Middle East as essential to his legacy or to his wanting to shape the world order. But where he is engaged in the Middle East, his belief is that he can get to the outcome that he wants without necessarily reflecting what the countries of the region want, with the exception of Israel. So it's his vision for Gaza, which is implementing. It's his vision about how he wants to see an endgame in Iran with the Islamic Republic. He's now showing more and more appetite for using military force to a certain extent. But what is not very clear is that after he's done all of this, what is the shape of the region itself?
My last question, and after which I think we still will have some time to get some people from the audience to ask a few questions. So, Malik, what's happening about the two-state solution? Is it finished? Is it likely to happen? What's the position?
No, I think that the two-state solution has long been finished, except this war has put an end to it. I mean, first of all, territorially, it's not feasible in a way, unless you imagine states as something like the composite sovereignty with two different people living in the same territory, somehow sharing sovereignty. It's almost impossible to imagine how you would carve out a territory, viable territory for Palestinians, unless it's the size of Monaco, with a flag. I mean, in Gaza, pretty much it's gone. Secondly, it's very clear that the consensus in Israel across the board is not in favor of a Palestinian state. The liberal Israelis who supported the idea now believe that it would be a mortal danger to them, that the Palestinians will never reconcile to whatever territory they get. They would always want to take their land back, and giving them a state with all the protections that goes with a state, ability with a state, is basically asking for a continuation of what happened on October 7th onwards. And the Israeli right wing, which never wanted a Palestinian state, wants all of the territory, particularly in the West Bank. And they're also the ascendant force in Israeli politics, and they're in no mood to actually compromise. And then you would say that any deal in any circumstance in any country is a deal making is a question of being forced to arrive at a compromise. I mean, deals are about compromises, because whether it's in business or politics, you cannot have everything, so you have to make a deal. Right now, the balance of power in this region does not tell you that Israel has any pressure on it to actually make a deal. Why would it make a deal? Aside from whatever you think about Israel, just generically think. They're winning militarily. The other side has no ability to dictate anything. Europe and the United States are applying no pressure. So exactly why would you give an inch when you can have it all, right? And so then it comes to the question of preaching to them out of the kindness of your heart, or think about the future, that's not viable. That's not really an argument. In politics, it's never an argument. And if Israel ever thought that, before it thought that it could have it all, it definitely thinks now that it could have it all. It could actually have more than Palestinian territory. It could also have South Lebanon. It could have additional territory that is taken in Syria. So this idea of a greater Israel, not even in sort of a biblical sense, but in sense of an Israel that has no Palestinians around it, no Palestinian states around it, and then pushes the Arabs much farther away from its borders and has much more defensible borders, is actually much more attractive to them and to their security than any compromise. They view compromise with the Palestinians and Arabs as a cause for insecurity, not security. And security right now, in their view, only comes from the muscle, and there is no reason for them to think otherwise. Nobody's forcing them to think otherwise.
Last question. Does this mean that not only are we stuck with Donald Trump for the next 3 years, Netanyahu is also here to stay and has been vindicated?
Well, I mean, I don't know that much about domestic Israeli politics. I mean, an election is due, but it would be difficult to defeat him just because of the composition of Israeli electorate, etc. But actually, I think at some level this is too much personalized to Netanyahu. Yes, he may have a sharper edge, greater power, greater inclination on certain policies. But I think he represents essentially much more the mood and where the consensus and center of gravity in Israeli politics is. The idea of no Palestinian state or a Palestinian state is a security threat to Israel, in my opinion, is a consensus. The Knesset voted almost 100% twice that they would not accept a Palestinian state, in fact bringing a rebuke from Vice President J.D. Vance at one point. So there is no Israeli politician that can run on a platform of negotiating with the Palestinians. Nobody would win an election on that platform. And as I said, there's no outside pressure on Israeli politics to actually force them to blame the United States to do so. So no, I don't see a happy ending right now here. Unfortunately, this sort of juggernaut is out and it's running its course. We just have to see where Lebanon, Syria, and Iran would settle.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. You are the first one to raise your hand. Go ahead. Can somebody give the lady a mic?
I can throw my voice.
In the back, then you're not.
If you could keep it as a question, not as a statement. Thank you.
I'll try my best. Thank you very much. I want to know your views on how the description you gave seems quite reactive, as if Biden was preparing for some sort of peace and 7th October came as a great surprise. And what is unfolding now is a surprise. What is your view on the fact that what happened on 7th October is a series of nakbas that started way back in 1300s in the Middle Ages? Perhaps the mode of the attack, the scale, and that has changed. But in terms of the nature and what Israel's objective has been, certainly seems to align with the nakbas that happened in the past. So what is your view on that? Secondly, the same thing seems to align with the protocols of Zion in 1903. And despite the fact that they have been discounted, how is it that the things that were designed way back in the early 1900s and the systematic takeover of financial markets, jurisprudence, politics, media, everything is aligning with what's happening now? So doesn't it seem that this is not a surprise, this is simply a revelation of something that has been in the making for a long time? Just would like your views on that.
First of all, I did not say that President Biden was thinking peace. President Biden was thinking of a balance of power or a situation in the Middle East that would allow the United States to focus its attentions on China through a series of deals that basically would bring certain stability and anchor to the region. Secondly, policymakers, first of all, they don't agree at all with any of the statements you said, but they also they don't think like that. This is policymakers are not historians trying to analyze history. They're looking at what's in front of them. And the way that the Biden administration, its assumption was that a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel was imminent. They had talked with both sides. It doesn't matter what happened in 1930s, 1950s, 1940s. Basically, it meant that are these two countries ready to sign a deal? What does that deal mean? Can we actually get a trade corridor connecting India to Europe going through the Arab world? And if these things happen, we're going to have an Arab-Israeli economic political alliance, and then we can have a nuclear deal with Iran, and the Saudis can have their deals with Iran, and then the Middle East will go sufficiently quiet so we can focus on China, on AI, on other sorts of things. So they had a theory about management of the Middle East. I mean, the policy making is not about explaining things. That's the job of professors and universities, etc. The job of the policymakers is to manage circumstances. And so for that reason, they were operating on the basis that the Palestinian issue has become irrelevant. I mean, the Arabs were acting like Palestinian issue was irrelevant. Nobody was, was ever since the Arab Spring, the assumption was that all the Arab countries were concerned with their own things. Nobody was going to fuss about the Palestinian issue, and therefore this is a unique time, just like UAE and Israel made a peace, Saudi Arabia and Israel make a peace, and then we move on. So they thought they had a way in which to make the Middle East irrelevant to global affairs, because it would become quiet like Latin America was, and they could focus on Asia. And then that whole idea was disrupted when the Palestinian issue came back center stage in a massive way. So the fundamental assumption around which their whole Middle East policy was shaped came undone.
Go ahead.
I've got the mic.
Okay.
What about China and Russia? Are they going to be just spectators during all this?
I don't think there's anything they can do. I mean, I think the expectation of what China and Russia are willing and capable of doing is exaggerated. I mean, the Chinese have no military presence of size in the region. They have shown no interest whatsoever in getting militarily involved in any other countries of the region. Periodically, they're happy to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, etc., but they don't want to play that role, and nor are they capable of doing so. I mean, yes, they are economic players to an extent, but I think we're at a period that right now they're not either willing or capable to play the kind of role that once upon a time the Soviet Union played in the Middle East. So it's the United States and it's the regional actors that basically really matter here. I mean, imagine China has not really tried to assert itself in any meaningful way in any of the wars that have happened in the Middle East since October 7th. And that's by design, but it's also a fact that they matter, but not necessarily in ways that are decisive to this conversation.
I recognize Taimur Rahman, but keep it to a question, Taimur. Thank you.
Ji, very, very short. Dr. Wali Nasser, do you recognize that what Israel has done in Gaza since October 7 over the last 2 years can be considered and called a genocide?
My job here is not, as an academic, is not political advocacy. I analyze the balance of power, the situation, etc. And in my opinion and what I consider is immaterial to the conversation. And so, the question is, and the future of the Middle East doesn't hang on what you and I call what has happened. The future of the Middle East relies on essentially where does this balance of power ends, regardless of what has happened.
Thank you. I think we have now come to the end of our session. There's a second session, and Wali is going to be in the second session as well. So if there are any questions left over, you can probably ask them in the second session. And thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Malik.
ਅਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਤਾ ਸੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਇਆ ਤੇ ਹੁਣ ਕੁਝ ਕਹਿ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਕਦੇ ਤਿੰਨ ਬੰਦੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੱਗੇ ਫਿਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਮਾਈਕ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਉਹ ਤਾਂ ਫਿਰਨੇ ਆ ਨਾ ਉਹ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ
Hello. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their valuable insights, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be welcoming our speakers and beginning the next session shortly under the title Pakistan between the US and China.
does the Arab world itself see and Turkey see things fitting? Because each of these countries, particularly the Arab countries and Turkey, also have a vision and a reaction to any kind of a balance of power in the region.